Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to week 5 of American History 2. Once again, I have to hope that my recording did not cut me off in mid-sentence or start me off in mid-sentence like it usually does. But in case it did, again, you should be here for week 5 in American History 2. Today, we're going to focus on something called the Gilded Age, which is when a bit of our more modern American economy really started to take shape. Now, before I really get into that, I of course am going to start things off with the key terms like I always do. I know you might be tired of me repeating this, but I just want to make sure I'm very clear. Always pay close attention to these terms. This is where a lot of your content quiz questions and other writing assignment questions are going to come from. So, for today, we're of course going to define what the Gilded Age is. Can't teach you about something if you don't know what it is. We're going to look at something called corporate consolidation. We're going to look at a group of individuals who are known as both the robber barons and the captains of industry. Obviously, two very different definitions. We're also going to look at something called capitalism, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. You're all familiar with it whether you realize it or not. And finally, we'll look at some famous labor unions and labor strikes. Now, of course, I want to make sure you're aware of upcoming assignments as well. The only thing you have due this week is your writing assignment 2, which is due September the 25th. As always, of course, it will be due at 5 p.m. Also, your first debate is coming up in a couple of weeks. The date and time of this debate is going to be announced via email. Actually, I'm recording this on the Saturday before class, but actually you should have the email suggesting debate times by the time you're viewing this. I plan to send it out Monday morning. Secondly, there will of course be an alternate assignment for those of you who cannot attend the debate. Now, to be very clear about something, and I will send out reminder emails about this as well in case you forget, this is just when the debate materials are due. So either what you use to plan for the debate or your alternate assignment is going to be what you turn in on October the 2nd. We'll do the actual debate sometime that week at a time that I will schedule, again, through email. Now, before we get into the real content for today, I do want to take some time to give you some writing assignment advice. Overall, the writing assignments were not bad. They were better than I might have otherwise expected. But, of course, as you might expect, there are still some things we can all improve on. So I want to just go over really quick some major issues that I saw pretty consistently that I want to help correct. Also, just to be FYI, I did grade these first writing assignments somewhat leniently, because again, it's our first writing assignment together and I didn't really have a chance to instruct you all on writing assignments individually. However, after I start giving you advice like this, and as we go forward in the class, I'll start grading more strictly as the semester goes on. So please do keep that in mind. Now, one of the major things I want to clear up are some issues with thesis statements I saw. Having a good thesis statement, as I've mentioned before, can be the key to having a good argument. So you need to make sure the argument you are making is sound before you write the rest of your paper. So, for example, one thing you need to make sure you're doing is that you are actually answering the question in the prompt. An example from my World Civilizations class for this is their first writing assignment. In their writing assignment, they had to write an essay arguing about what they thought the most important factor was in the early colonization of the Americas and Africa. What a lot of them would end up doing is summarizing the major effects of colonization. They'd make a very good argument about how each factor of colonization played a role in allowing colonization to happen, but that wasn't the prompt. The prompt is that you pick one, argue why it's the most important. For example, it's very similar to your final essay. I don't want you to try to argue about how every single thing, for example, in world history was important. You're supposed to pick 3 and make an argument about those 3 things. So again, make sure you're answering what the prompt is asking. Don't do something else. Also, this is a fairly common issue in this class so far as well. Don't argue against yourself. I know Reconstruction can be a very difficult system to praise. That's kind of one of the things I was trying to get across. But what a lot of you would do is you would say in your argument or in your thesis statement that Reconstruction was an improvement over slavery, but then you would just spend the rest of the essay talking about how terrible Reconstruction was and how it took freedoms away from African Americans. That's not exactly a strong argument for how Reconstruction was an improvement. Now, some of you were still able to successfully talk about the negatives of Reconstruction, but also mention the positives that came along with it. But don't make one argument, but then have all of your evidence essentially argue the opposite. Please let me know if that's confusing in any way, and I'm more than happy to give individual feedback in office hours or through email. But essentially, if you make an argument, stick with it. Make sure your evidence overall supports that argument. Lastly, most of us did pretty well at this, but of course we can improve a little bit. Make sure you include your argument and your major supporting topics. From what I'm hearing, I think part of the issue is that some of you might actually be overthinking the thesis statement almost, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It does mean that a lot of you care and are putting in good effort. However, I don't expect your thesis statement to list out in humongous detail every single thing your essay is going to discuss either. I essentially, like I've said before, just wanted to tell me your argument and the supporting topics that your paragraphs are going to be about. So for example, let's say like I have here, you were writing an essay claiming that Star Wars was better than Star Trek. This would be a perfectly acceptable thesis statement right here. Star Wars is better than Star Trek because of its superior writing, cinematography, and acting. So see, I didn't have to go into a ton of detail about what the writing is like necessarily, what the cinematography is like, or what the acting is like. All I did was state my argument and set up what my major topics in my body paragraphs are going to be about. That's all I'm looking for. You don't have to tell me every single thing you're necessarily arguing for. Now, little more basic stuff. Structure, intro, body paragraphs, conclusion. This wasn't very common, but a few of you would just put in one giant paragraph. Don't do that. Like I said here at this thesis statement, I want your essay to be broken up, very well organized, broken up into an introduction, body paragraphs about each major topic, and then your conclusion. Sources, primary sources must be included. You don't have to have a majority of primary sources, but there do need to be primary sources in there. Secondly, in-text citations are required. It's not just enough to have a works cited page. You have to show me in your essay how you actually use the sources. Otherwise, anyone could just come in and just put random sources in the works cited page and call it a day. I want you to actually cite them so I know how you're making use of them. Finally, avoid large block quotes, please. A few people would have very large block quotes that for some of them would take up about half of the essay. This to me, oftentimes, and to your other instructors most likely, a lot of times looks like you're either at least trying to pad out the word count or to essentially plagiarize, in all seriousness. So again, I didn't accuse anyone of plagiarizing if they had these large block quotes, this time at the very least, but try to avoid having such paragraph-long block quotes in the future. It makes it look like you're just trying to pad out the word count. What you should do is spend most of your time analyzing the sources you have and not just quoting them directly. So for example, you could just take a small quote from a source and then spend more time arguing about what it means in your own words. Not just what a few people will do, just put the large block quote and say, this is how this supports my argument in just one single sentence. You're not really explaining in your own words. Make sure it's your own words, not block quotes. So, of course, again, if there's any questions about any of this, please let me know. I just wanted to spend a couple minutes on that to give you all some pointers. Next up, be prepared to review the race riots of 1898. As you might imagine, that's going to be coming up on some quizzes and assignments in the near future. So, what you need to do for your upcoming assignments is be prepared to answer these questions about the riot. Be prepared to explain what was the justification for starting the riot, what was the actual cause for starting the riot, what was the outcome, and what happened to some of the participants in the riot, and why is that so important for us to remember. So yeah, again, keep these questions in mind as we go forward. This is again where I would actually discuss things with you guys if we were all here in person, but I'm just talking to a camera, so this is the best we can do. Now, finally, we're going to get a little bit more into what we're going to discuss today, which is again the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age actually got its name from a book co-authored by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. In this book, he gave a definition for what the Gilded Age essentially is. A Gilded Age is where something is gold and shiny on the outside, but full of corruption and decay on the outside. So, can anyone describe that for me in their own words? And by that I mean pause the video, think about it for a second, and then we'll discuss it. I'll discuss it to your imaginary self. Whichever. Alright, now that my awkward pause is over, as you might have guessed, essentially what he's arguing is that society looks prosperous and looks like there's a lot of wealth going around, but inside it's actually corrupt and decayed and just a horrible place. So, think about in some of the areas we discussed how America might have been a Gilded Age, and how might the content we see today make America a Gilded Age. So, essentially, what are some evidence of things that make it look like America is very prosperous, but what are some examples that make it look like it's actually just a corrupt and decayed mess? Now, one of the major characteristics of the Gilded Age was the rise of the corporation. This is when modern corporate entities that we're more familiar with today really got their start. For example, one we've already talked about a little bit is the Great Transcontinental Railroad. Railroads were some of the first corporations because of their importance in transporting goods all across the country. Now, corporate consolidation is essentially where a group of investors, or also known as partners, invest in a company and share the profits and the risk. So essentially, they all put in a little bit of their money into this company, so they all get a share of the profits, and the losses, or any losses the company has, is divided among them. So starting off on a positive note, what might be some of the good things about that system? Again, awkward pause. Hopefully you're thinking about this at home. Yes, very good, imaginary audience. Yes, some of the common positives, especially pro-capitalist people will point out for a corporation, is that since people are investing in the company, you can get a lot more money invested into a company than any one person would be able to do on their own. So you're able to afford to set up huge transcontinental railroads like the Great Transcontinental Railroad Corporation. Also, sharing the risks can be beneficial for everyone involved. Because, of course, let's say I wanted to start a pizza company. I must be hungry. I guess that's why that's the first thing that popped in my head. But if I put down all the money myself for a pizza company, if it fails, there, of course, goes all my money. However, let's say I got a bunch of my friends to help invest in this pizza company with me. If it fails, we all share the losses amongst ourselves. So setting up a corporation is a little bit less risky for each individual. However, why might a corporation be a bad thing in some instances? To give you a modern example while you think about this, think about some of the negatives associated with Walmart. Why did some people hate Walmart? And awkward pause. Pause the video and think about this, please. I'd love it. Yeah, as we're going to see here in this lecture today, some of the common negatives associated with these corporations is how powerful they are. So again, one is associated with some of the positives. Since some people are able to invest their money into a corporation and make it grow larger than they ever could on their own, corporations often get very powerful. So you'll have, instead of having a bunch of small businesses going around doing some sort of service, you get a big corporation like Walmart that has a lot of money invested into it that can overpower all these other businesses. So essentially, again, the positives are that it's less risky, you can get more accomplished than just one person could do on their own, but they sometimes can get too powerful. Few ways this was accomplished. There are a few corporate practices that started coming up during this time. For example, you had money pools where people would pool their money together to invest. You have holding companies, and you, of course, have trusts, for any of you who know trust fund kids. So these were all essentially meant to establish a monopoly. Can anyone at home tell me, or send to me digitally in the future, what is a monopoly? These awkward pauses are my least favorite part. It reminds me that I have no one to talk to right now. But yes, hopefully students who figured it out at home are already new. A monopoly is when one corporation or one business controls the entire market for whatever service they have. For example, it turns out I don't think as many of you out your way are as familiar with this as people are in my neck of the woods, which is probably the most country thing I've ever said. But anyway, around here, pretty much everyone gets their internet from Frontier. Now, if anyone of you actually are involved with Frontier or have family members who work at Frontier, I do apologize for what I'm going to have to say, but what does maybe some of the Frontier experience and some of these other monopolies show about how monopolies can be a problem? Or what happens when one industry controls an entire market? Again, awkward pause. Yes, as some of you might know who have had experience with monopolies, when a business controls the entire market, there's no competition. Don't know why it took me so long to say that. There's no competition that is supposed to make a capitalist market thrive. So essentially, if the company owns the entire market, they can charge whatever they want, they can do whatever they want, because they know that nobody else is there, no one's going to have any other company to go to. So, again, for the Frontier example, Frontier has a very bad reputation around where I live because they're notoriously very slow to respond to calls or to help people's internet. Their internet systems are not very high quality, but there's no one else around here for us to go. So again, monopolies can typically lead to bad service. Now, a couple of ways monopolies are set up. First, you have horizontal integration, which is where you organize all of the companies in the same field. So essentially, you would buy out every single company or as many companies as you can that are doing the same thing as you. Vertical integration is where you control the steps in producing a single commodity. So let's say, for example, you owned a car company. If you wanted to set up a vertical integration, you would buy out every single company that had anything to do with producing various parts of a car. So the one that gets the resources to make the car, the one that assembles the car, the one that sells the car, you would control every single aspect of it. Now, in order to give you a better idea of how this typically works, I do have a economic YouTube video for you to explain some specific examples and more modern examples of how horizontal and vertical integration works. As you're watching this, please keep in mind a couple of questions. What are some of the ways a business can carry out a horizontal integration? How exactly does it work? Then, what are some ways a business can carry out a vertical integration? We're going to go over a couple of these today, as you might imagine. But here's a quick example of a vertical integration. Let's again say you have own a meat industry. You could own all the cattle. You could own all the slaughterhouses. You could own all the railroad cars that transport the cows. You can own all the cooled warehouses that preserve the cows. You could own all the meat packing plants that prepare the meat. And you could own all the deliveries. Therefore, you own every aspect of the production. Or if you own an oil company, you could just buy out other oil companies. So again, those are the two major ways a monopoly is set up. Now, some of the most famous individuals for setting up these monopolies were, as I mentioned before, the robber barons, or sometimes called the captains of industry. A few of the most famous ones. John D. Rockefeller, who lived from 1839 to 1937, set up the Standard Oil Company. He was noteworthy for setting up the first legal trust and was a big practicer of horizontal integration. Many times he would buy railroad companies and iron mines. Now again, why is that going to be beneficial that he owns all of these for his oil company? Which, by the way, I think I actually got these mixed up. This is supposed to be vertical integration. This is supposed to be horizontal integration. My apologies, that's a typo on my part. But still, link back to what I just said about integration. Why would this be such a beneficial thing for him? Again, awkward pause. Yeah, again, he controls every aspect of the product that's being produced, so he doesn't have to go through any other middlemen. If he didn't own these railroad companies and these iron mines, he'd have to pay their prices in order to transport his products and get access to the resources he needs. But since he owns them, he can essentially charge whatever he wants, doesn't have to pay any fines. Also, he was a big practicer of horizontal integration. Again, I got these two mixed up, where he would go buy out competing oil companies. So he has no competitors, he's producing all the oil. J.P. Morgan was also an influential person during this time period. He lived from 1837 to 1913, and he was a famous financier and banker. One of the reasons he was so important is he was the one who's helped set up these first legal trusts. He set up the money pools. He helped set up the finances for a lot of these first corporations. Andrew Carnegie is another one most of you are probably familiar with. He lived from 1835 to 1919, and he set up something called the Carnegie Steel Company. Now, Carnegie is noteworthy for one of his publications, which in 1889 was the Gospel of Wealth. In this, he argued that it was the duty of the rich to give their wealth back to the community. They should go support the arts, the schools, and hospitals. Now, what are some pros of this idea? So I have to let my cat out of here for a second. Think about that while I'm gone. Bye-bye, little Boots. Her name is Boots, by the way, if you didn't guess. But anyway, of course, the positives seem pretty obvious. Like you're supporting arts, artists, actors, all that fun stuff. You're supporting education, which of course can be beneficial, give better supplies for schools, support universities, and you're of course supporting hospitals. Now, why might that actually be a bad thing, however? Think about how some people disagree on how we should benefit the poor and worse off aspects of our society. Awkward pause. But yeah, as some of you might be aware, some people believe that we should help out the poor more directly. Set up things like tax breaks, higher taxes on the rich, essentially more quote-unquote socialist policies for wealth redistribution. So some people would argue about this, that if you're giving money to the arts, the schools, and hospitals, you're not really benefiting the poor because they wouldn't have access to a lot of these things anyway. So again, it just shows how some people have different ideas on how to actually benefit the poorer aspects of society. There's on the one hand the sort of gospel of wealth idea. You give it back to things that help people pick themselves up by their bootstraps, that kind of idea, or some more ideas about wealth redistribution and giving directly to the community. So again, keep that in mind. That's not a debate that's going anywhere anytime soon, as I'm sure you are all aware who've looked at the news recently. He was also a big practicer of vertical integration. He would buy out all the mines, railroads, and various competing companies. So again, he could control every aspect of the production of steel. Now, because of these barons, capitalism became a much more widespread and well-known system throughout America. Now, this should be a pretty easy one. Can anyone tell me what capitalism is? Okay, of course. Capitalism is the idea of a free market and free labor system. Instead of the entire public collectively owning businesses or the government owning and controlling businesses, each person individually owns their own property, can own their own business, and own their own means of production. Now, some of the typical benefits associated with capitalism. Anyone know what those are back at home? Yeah, as many of you are probably aware as well, some of the benefits associated with capitalism is the idea that it creates competition. People own their own products and own their own wealth, so they're going to try to compete to get more access to that wealth. It'll lead to better products and cheaper prices. Now, what are some of the more negative aspects associated with capitalism? Again, this shows the more social, as many of you probably guessed, this shows the more socialist opinions some people in this country have. A lot of people don't like the idea that capitalism is unregulated. They would argue that when capitalism is unregulated and people start winning these competitions, you get these robber barons and you get these corporations that hoard all the wealth. So again, these debates start popping up and are very common in the country at this time. Again, for any of you who saw, like, for example, Bernie Sanders' campaign in the past couple of years, these debates and questions aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Another problematic belief that came up during this time was Darwinism and social Darwinism. Now, as many of you probably know, the Darwinism idea got its start with Charles Darwin, who published On the Origin of Species in 1859. The basics of his argument was the survival of the fittest theory. Essentially, in nature, whatever is the most fit or the most able to survive will survive, and those traits will get passed on. The species will evolve and grow over time. Very common theory we're all familiar with. This, in turn, however, popularized social Darwinism and laissez-faire economics. I've always had trouble pronouncing that for some reason. Now, can anyone tell me what social Darwinism actually means? To give you a hint, look at what's going on in this picture right here. Awkward pauses again. Yeah, as some of you have probably heard of, or you might be able to guess from this picture, social Darwinism was the idea that people who deserve to be rich or are morally and socially upright would succeed in the economy and would be rich, and those who weren't, because of bad morality, vices, whatever it was, would not be successful. This can spread over, as we'll talk a little bit more about next week as well, into ideas of America's relationship with the world as well. A lot of Americans believe that it was our duty, because of our socially Darwinistic superiority, to educate the rest of the world and share our enlightenment and wealth with other nations. This, of course, led to many racist stereotypes, as you can see here. In this picture, you can tell that these are all, of course, minorities or minority groups in America or various other countries around us being represented by small children. That is not a coincidence, as you might have guessed. Here we have Uncle Sam, America, teaching these infant nations, as far as we were concerned, how to better survive and to improve themselves. This again comes to social Darwinistic idea. We believed ourselves superior to these other nations in the world, and also including other nations within our nation, as you can see with the Native American over here in the corner, that we felt it was our duty to educate them. So yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more next week. Led to some pretty complicated issues. Anyway, one thing I do want to mention just briefly is the rise of urbanization as well. Urbanization also commenced quite rapidly during the Gilded Age. Now, this is a pretty basic idea about urbanization. Why does urbanization typically happen? And in this case, why did it happen during the Gilded Age? Hopefully you all can't hear that dog barking, but if you can, my apologies. Yeah, urbanization typically happens as cities grow and people try to flock to these cities to get access to these new jobs. So, once these new industries start popping up in cities and are making a lot of money, people start moving to the cities to try to take advantage of them. Old immigrants who had come to the country from the 1700s to the 1800s are probably who a lot of you in this area are ultimately descended from. You have your English, your Scots, your Irish, your Scotch-Irish, and some Germans coming in this time period mostly. These new immigrants are coming primarily from Italy, Greece, Poland, and Russia, so more Eastern European nations. For example, by 1890 in Chicago, 90% of the residents were non-US born. They had been born in other countries and had immigrated to the area. Now, think ahead, this will keep coming up as well. How is this going to change America and make America look a little bit different? Keep that in mind as we continue as well. Now, one of the last things we'll look at is some of the big labor unions and some of the big labor strikes. Urbanization led to a rise of mass production by 1800. What exactly is mass production? Already put that in there a little bit for you. Yeah, of course, mass production is just like it says, the mass production of a product, typically by machines. Now, what are the benefits and drawbacks of this system? Awkward pause again. Hopefully you'll figure this out at home. Alright, again, and this is again associated with Walmart a little bit. Everything, when you go to Walmart, everything is typically fairly cheap. That's one of the main things they advertise. That's because since they produce so much of one product, they can afford to sell it for a pretty cheap price and still make a profit. So again, it can lead to lower prices for consumers. However, what are the drawbacks of mass production? Again, typically keeping in mind that a lot of this is done with machinery. Alright, very good, listeners at home, as I'm assuming you answered this correctly. It can hurt people's jobs as well. It makes workers more disposable and can often lead to lower wages as well. Because of this, a lot of labor organizations and labor unions rose up during this period to try to protect the rights of workers. For example, you had the Knights of Labor, who existed from around 1869 to 1990. This group was violent with a whole lot of strikes. They failed by 1900 and fell apart. Now, why exactly do you think this group was so unsuccessful? And maybe to give you a more modern example to compare this with, think about why a lot of people are upset with Black Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter riots and Black Lives Matter demonstrations. What do people typically call to try to discredit those movements? Alright, yes, again, very good. This one should be pretty obvious for anyone with a working internet or news connection. It's the violence. Just like today, a lot of people, when they would associate violence with these labor movements, they would use that to completely discredit them. People a lot of times get turned off of things due to violence. And again, just to be clear, I'm not taking a stance necessarily on the Black Lives Matter movement or protests right now. That's a very complicated issue. We will hopefully get to it a little bit later. But as I'm sure you can all see, it is the violence associated with some of these riots and demonstrations is something various groups try to use to discredit them. So again, violence being associated with these types of movements is nothing new. The American Federation of Labor was a bit more successful. They lasted from 1886 until about 1955. One of the things that helped them out was they accepted capitalism and private property. They also succeeded in getting an 8-hour workday. So for those of you who work and have an 8-hour workday limit, you can thank the American Federation of Labor. Now, why do you think they were a bit more successful than the Knights of Labor? Alright, again, it's probably very obvious. For one, less violence was associated with them, of course, but also they accepted capitalism and private property. They didn't want to completely do away with capitalist systems or to abolish private property. They just wanted to increase workers' rights. Again, remember, like I mentioned, a lot of people were scared of these socialistic ideas that were coming up in opposition to capitalism. These guys decided to still call themselves capitalists and just claim they were working for rights. So that, along with their lack of violence, made them a lot less threatening to various parts of society. However, as many of you all know, despite this, a lot of times unions do still tend to struggle in America. A couple of reasons why, and we'll get into more detail about these over the next couple of weeks. But for one, state and federal government involvement. Whose side do you think the government typically takes in these labor strikes? Blacklisting is also a major problem. For those of you who don't know what blacklisting is where a company basically singles out a worker who's being an agitator, a union sympathizer typically in this case, and basically sends their name out to every other company in their field, telling them not to hire them because they're a part of a union or they're an agitator. So essentially you get cut out of the industry and can't get a job. Radical violence is of course a major issue. As you can see depicted here, one of these labor unions was involved in the infamous Haymarket bombing in 1886, where many individuals and police officers were killed or wounded. Obviously, again, violence typically scares people and turns them off of different organizations. Finally, and we talked about this a little bit last week, the rising immigrant and free black population was also a big problem. What's going to happen when especially these free African Americans get involved in unions? Think about what happened last week. Alright, yes, very good, imaginary listeners. Is again, these outside groups are going to use racism to their advantage. They'll accuse these groups of trying to promote black equality, trying to promote Negro rule, all those things we talked about last week. So again, that makes them very easy targets, makes a lot of people who are still against black equality at this time less than eager to join these unions. Now, just to wrap things up, to give you a couple of examples of what some of the government responses were. In 1892, you had the infamous Homestead Strike, where an association of iron and steel workers went up against the Carnegie Steel Plant. At the end, 8,000 state militia troops escorted strikebreakers into the plant. Strikebreakers are, of course, workers who you send in to take the jobs of people who are on strike. This was in response to the attempted assassination of one of Carnegie's lieutenants, Harry Frick. So this again shows how people were scared of violence during this time and used that to discredit labor movements. So again, the government is not coming in on the side of the strikers at this point. 2 years later, you have the infamous Pullman strike, where the American Railway Union goes off against the Pullman Palace Car Company. This is actually one of the largest strikes in American history, where workers all across 27 states refused to do any work for the railroad company due to wage cuts. As a result of this, President Grover Cleveland, who was a president at the time, sent in federal troops to end the strike. Now, looking at the nature of this strike specifically, why do you think the government came in on the corporation side? I'll let you think about it for a second. Alright, as you might imagine, it's because of the importance of this corporation to America as a whole. As I mentioned a few times, the railroad companies were extremely important to opening up the country to further investment and exploration, and were very important in helping these various companies get their products all across the country. So since you have workers across 27 states, which was well over half of the states in the Union at this time especially, refusing to work, it's essentially going to shut down trade all across the country. Essentially the trump card corporations a lot of times get to pull, and why the government typically takes their side. They're so important to how our economy functions that the government wants to take their side so the economy doesn't collapse. Now, keep this in mind as we talk about a little bit more next week. What role do unions play in our economy, and how do you think unions can overcome some of the difficulties we've looked at today? So keep that in mind, of course. And just remember before I let you go, one last time, you of course have these upcoming due dates. Make sure you're prepared for all of these assignments. Let me know if you have any questions. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you in topic 2.